What is up, my cutouts? Cardboard Ninja here, coming at you with the unified tier list for every single cabin in Crossout as of this date, which is July 1st, 2022. This unified tier list has 50 different cabins on it, and this is not just a heavy cabin tier list or a medium or light cabin tier lists and how they relate to each other, but how they relate to the overall game. So this is going to be somewhat different from the other tier lists I've created insofar as that they're not just being compared against each other, but they're being compared in general. And then in addition to this, this comes after the update, the balance update earlier this year, that nerfed a significant sum of cabins. A lot of them took a speed hit, some of them gained a buff to their perks, and so on and so forth, and we'll be going over those and how they've changed may or may not have changed where they landed on the tier list. So first we're going to define the tiers. D tier, also known as the worst tier. These cabins are all best avoided. They're bad. You don't really want to use them. This is kind of obvious. If you have to use them, but you're going to want to upgrade out of them as soon as you possibly can. Generally, they are good at nothing, or they do something and are outperformed at the one thing that they do at all. C tier. These are niche one-trick cabins. These are cabins that change how you play Crossout, or how you build a building Crossout, but doesn't necessarily change the counterplay against you. So for example, an opponent will look at you, and you're using your cabin, and they're going to treat you exactly like they would treat somebody else. There's nothing that it's going to change their gameplay, but you had to build very specifically around the cabin's geometry, or you had to build very specifically due to the one niche, one trick that the cabin allows, and you're basically still at a detriment. Cabins in C tier, you can build towards these cabins perks, but usually they're not the best at those perks that you have to build towards. And what they do generally isn't the most effective thing at any given power score. B tier are your good, general purpose cabins. They're solid, they're effective, they're good. They're generally good cabins. These are cabins you want. They're cabins that you want to hold on to. They struggle outside of certain power score bands, or they don't reach the end game, but they are remarkably good cabins. Most people keep cabins of these tier around in their inventory just in case they're trying to build towards a specific power score. B tier is just good general purpose cabins. They're not bad. They're not the best, but they're certainly not bad. And this is where everything at B tier or above, just solid cabins. A tier. They are the actual one tricks of the game. A tier are cabins that excel in wide variety of power score bands, and in general their perks are very, very high value, but very, very specific. They do one specific thing better than anybody else, and what they do is phenomenal. That's usually what your solid A tier perk cabin will get you into endgame. Literally, you'll find these cabins in Clan Wars. You'll find these cabins in basically raids. You'll find them anywhere. A tier cabins, very solid cabins. Sometimes they're even the best at what they do, but what they do is specific. And finally, you have your S tier universal cabins. These are simply the best thing in the game. They're either the best thing at what they do, they change game mechanics, and unlike those in C tier where you have to build towards your cabin's perk in order to make it so your build works at all, but doesn't change at all how other players play the game against you, S tier cabins, entirely different. They not only do you, not necessarily have to build towards the perk, but whether or not you do or don't, it actually changes how opponents play the game against you. They either have to choose not to attack you at certain times, or they won't be able to find you, or they have to put things onto their build to try and counter your build. Things like that. S tier universal cabins are the creme de la creme, top of the game, top in class. They excel in every power score and any power score that they are dragged into, and the key characteristic of the universal cabin is that it is usually weapon agnostic, meaning you don't need to have pyres, you don't need to have tsunamis, you don't need to have a specific weapon to make these cabins work. They just always work with everything. All right, so now that we've defined the tiers, let's get into it. We're going to just start off with the way these cabins are set up, and we're going to start with the Sprinter. So originally I had the Sprinter set at C tier. If you guys had seen my previous tier list for this, the Sprinter unfortunately took a pretty hard nerf in the recent update, cutting 10 kph off of its top speed and not improving its power. For those of us who don't know, acceleration and power are two sides of the same coin. I'm sorry, acceleration is based on cabin top speed. So cabin top speed and power are two sides of the same coin for acceleration. And so the Sprinter took a major hit. It's just way slower than it used to be. It still functions, but I would argue that it is at the dead bottom of C tier. It used to be a pretty good C tier cabin, but at this point, it's just bottom of C tier. You can do builds with a Sprinter, but it's rough. I'm not going to lie to you. It's still rough because of the fact that it is just obscenely slow. It's just obscenely slow. The better version of this is actually the Duster, also at C tier. The Duster, if you can get a hold of it, is a light cabin, whereas the Sprinter is a medium cabin. The reason why the Sprinter came down in top speed compared to the Duster was because of the fact that the Duster is a light cabin, the Sprinter is considered a medium cabin. And so in that great speed normalization that ended up happening, medium cabins were kept within a speed band range, and so unfortunately, the Sprinter got caught in that. One of the many cabins at medium that one of the medium cabins that just caught it hard. So it's still C tier, just the bottom of C tier. Speaking of cabins that are phenomenal, we're going to go to the Wyvern. B tier. It is a very solid cabin, still great in any power score that it can be brought to. It has no end game, but typically is a great beginner cabin, worth fusing. As I said before in previous tier lists, it is the other side of the coin with the Growl. Also a phenomenal B tier cabin. These are cabins that you will come back to forever. The Growl cabin is Crossout, by the way. It is the staple cabin of Crossout. If you end up playing, if you're a brand new player, you're going to see this on everybody. You're going to see this, you're going to see the Growl or the Wyvern basically on everybody. And even when you start getting into like 7K, 8K power scores, you're still going to see the Growl cabin around. The Growl cabin is that good. Whenever anybody wants to take their super-powered Omega guns and drag them all the way down to Seal Club, they're going to use the Growl. That 11 energy is nothing to scoff at. It's really that important, and that keeps it viable. Below it, or on par with it, is the Wyvern, as I said. It basically trades 1 energy for better power and better mass. So you're going to see low-tier Spider Walkers. You know, if you're trying to drag big rams down into low power score, you're going to see the Wyvern on this because it has enough mass to actually pull it off. And also, it's got a decent top speed. So those are your standard B tiers. Moving on, we got the WWT1 D tier. Horrible cabin. Most notably, you're only going to see this in the exhibition, rocking, what are those things called? Rocking Scorpion, a single Scorpion, if you want to drag a Scorp really low tier. It's a terrible cabin, by far and away. In addition to that, we're going to get the worst cabin in the game here as soon as possible. I think it is the Gorilla. We're going to put that at the very bottom of D tier. By design, the Gorilla is the worst cabin in the entire game. By design. They designed it this way. They straight up said, this is the worst cabin in the game. It's written in the description. And therefore, it is the bottom of D tier. Not exactly, you know, the best. Then we've got the Thug and the Huntsman. They are the same cabin. Effectively, one has more power. The other one has a little bit more maximum tonnage. They are both terrible. They're just extensions of the Gorilla. From there, we're going to grab the Docker, which is a D tier heavy cabin. Very bad cabin. Gonna want to skip it. It is a perfect cube, even though it doesn't look like a perfect cube. Or, I'm sorry, the WWT1 is a perfect cube. The Docker is also. It's just, you know, angled in the front. Not much to say about these, other than the fact that they're particularly poor. Not much more to say about them. I actually did cover these in greater detail in my previous tier list, but in reality, these are all cabins that you, in general, are going to want to skip. All of them are exceedingly outclassed by rare cabins, and they're not even close. By the way, one final note about the Gorilla, there is a special thing about it that other people may not know. One, it's got the lowest top speed of it. I think it comes in at 60, but then in addition to that, it also has the lowest energy of any cabin in the game. It is just the worst. Just the worst. It's intentionally the worst by design. The Carapace is also a D tier cabin. The Carapace has the lowest top speed in the game at 50 kilometers an hour. It's got a lot of mass on it, and in fact, in my previous video, I said that it had even less mass than it does have. It actually has more mass than I said it does, but it is still terrible. It is a cabin that is designed specifically to run with tracks and the slower tracks. Tracks, especially the slower tracks, are very poor. They aren't meta in any way, shape, or form. They fall off at like 5 to 7k power score. After that, they just get bodied by every other movement part in the game, including regular wheels. So having a cabin that specifically doesn't give a perk, but is specifically top speed capped to land at the same range as tracks just doesn't bode well for the carapace. It's got interesting geometry, but nothing that saves it. The Fury originally came in at D tier and was nerfed on my previous tier list, but in retrospect, I would say the Fury and the Bear are both C tier cabins. The reason why is because even though the Bear and the Fury are the best of the trucker cabins, and the Bear used to be even better, but the Bear and the Fury both caught a 5 kph nerf, bringing them down. But because of the fact that there was this mass normalization across all of Crossout, and most movement speeds were reduced, that actually doesn't really pan out that much. The Fury's hitboxes are exceptionally poor. No, I'm sorry, not hitboxes. The hitbox is identical between the Fury, Bear, Thug, Huntsman, and Gorilla, but the Weld points aren't. Building with the Fury at low power score is infuriating, forgive the pun, only because of the fact on the underside of these things are a 4-pin weld point for frame. It's really bad. The Bear has basically the maximum number of weld points you can get, has more mass, has more hit points, etc., but lower top speed. So two sides of the same coin, Fury and the Bear. I would bring the Fury out of D tier, up into C tier. Well done. Well done. Favorite cabin, originally ranked at A tier. The favorite cabin received a speed nerf, obviously, of, I think it was 5 kph. After its perk change, it's still good at basically everything it does. At everything it does. It buffs all weapons that overheat, and as such, it still sits in A tier, where it basically belongs. It's not an S tier cabin by any means because it doesn't have the maximum mass, it doesn't have the speed, but what it does do is it is the only weapon, it's the only cabin, effectively, that's going to buff a significant sum of weapons in Crossout. Just a significant sum of them. Basically, you've got your Arbiters, you've got your Retchers, you've got, believe it or not, not Incinerators, I'm sorry, Remedies, you've got Dracos. Even though there is a better cabin for that, they do this. The favorite is an alternate cabin for all of those. You've got your Whirl builds. Whirls can use the favorite. Anything that overheats, obviously, you've got your autocannon builds that use the favorite. Long story short, favorite is a very, very good cabin. Sits there, right there, shining beacon of A tier. Right next to that is the Photon. It's your go-to energy cabin of Crossout. Just the go-to energy cabin of Crossout. Overheating your opponent is very easy right now. There's plenty of ways, Trombone especially, of getting that maximum heat on your opponent, and the Photon changes the bonus damage from 100% to 130%. It's still good. It synergizes extremely well with Claw Wheels, obviously, for obvious reasons. It works perfectly with Gravistars for Gravistar dogs. Anything that heats on its own, Destructors, Triggers, you name it. And the Photon is there for you. Next up is the Irmak. I don't have the Irmak listed on my heavy cabin tier list, and here's why. Heavy cabin tier list was made before the release of the Irmak. So the Irmak has a maximum mass, or maximum adjusted available mass of 14,800. It says 18,000, but it's got its own mass, so it brings it down to 14,800, which puts it kind of in the middle, low end of heavy cabins. But the Irmak's perk is damage resistance. So every single time that you take a hit, your damage resistance will increase. There's a cooldown between the hits, but ultimately, you basically constantly stack up damage resistance. I have to create a video on how damage resistance works because it's not straightforward. You don't get an actual 30% damage resistance, but whatever. It doesn't really matter for the sake of this video. When this cabin came out, not a lot of people thought it was good. And its price went accordingly. However, over time, people have found that the Irmak makes a very solid cabin. It makes makes it so a build is very difficult to destroy, because of the fact that the damage resistance, very similarly to the Call, which is right next to it, surprisingly here, I didn't do that intentionally. It gives you your entire build 30% damage resistance, and this is very good. You can't say when you get that 30% damage bonus, like with the cohort, but unlike the cohort, the duration can theoretically be eternal, depending on whether or not your opponents are constantly hitting the cabin. So it makes it somewhat difficult to rank this cabin, but with that said, it does change how your opponents make your opponents play the game. They have to not aim at your cabin intentionally. They have to try and aim for components, trying to evade cabin hits, as that's just going to increase your damage resistance. As proven by Rotfish Bandit, as well as others, you can create some exceptionally tanky Irmak builds, as in your effective hit points, EHP, are so incredibly high because you fuse the Irmak for hit points, and then you also put an averter on it, and then as it takes damage, it just keeps stacking damage resistance up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 40-something%, which will basically give you 40 or something % more hit points on whatever hit points you currently have. The Irmak is in a very interesting spot. I'm going to put it into A tier, only because of the fact that it's very difficult for me to choose to rank a heavy cabin into S tier. Truly, energy is important, and so I stand by the idea that there's no such thing as an S tier heavy cabin, but Irmak is really close. It can create some very frustrating situations for your opponent, especially when combined with ruptures, especially when combined with anything else in the game that provides more damage resistance, as it does stack linearly, though you're going to receive asymptoting results. Again, damage resistance is its own thing. Moving on to the next damage resistance providing cabin, you've got the Call. The Call gives you movement speed, not movement speed, dang it, I keep getting that wrong. It gives your cabin power and damage reduction, 10% damage reduction for each drone or turret launched, and I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% power for each drone or turret launched. The Call is an exceptionally good drone cabin. Please note, drone, not necessarily turret cabin, but drone cabin, and would be the best drone cabin in the game. That said, drones aren't very good. In fact, if you look at the weapon tier list that was made by Rotfish Bandit and Mr. G, there isn't a drone or turret in the entire game that ranks higher than like C or D tier. So, because of those reasons, the Call is a B tier cabin. It's actually got decent stats. It also lost speed, which sucks. If I recall, it is now down from 85 down to 77 kilometers an hour. So, it's slower than it needs to be, which is pretty brutal, though it does have the damage resistance when your turrets or drones are out, provided that your opponents don't shoot those down. Yeah, not much more to say about that other than it is the premier drone cabin, but other than that, it isn't much more than that. It is probably not as high in B tier as one would assume, also, but I would still give it a B tier. Next up is the Howl. The Howl is actually a pretty dang good cabin. It has a universal perk, one that is, though it is a universal perk, it changes the way that you have to drive. So you have to get close to your opponent in order to maintain the Howl's perk. The Howl will lose it gains up to 20% damage over, I think it's around 10 seconds, but it will drop that 20% damage bonus like that. It'll drop that in around 4 seconds. So as if you leave that very, very tight 35-meter radius. So the Howl is in a very interesting spot. It did lose speed. It lost to 10 kilometers an hour, making it pretty slow. It's kind of like a PT Cruiser now. Originally, I ranked the Howl at A tier, and it is universal, but in reality, nowadays, with the speed nerf and how light cabins are still faster, the time it takes to actually stack that damage bonus is getting more and more brutal, especially with not being able to get in and get out or stay in as well. The Howl, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to re-rank it at B tier. It definitely fell down a tier after the nerfs, but it's still a solid cabin, still worth having, and so on and so forth. So what's next? We're gonna go to the very, very, very bottom of S tier with the Omnibox. Omnibox, what can I say? It did receive a nerf in the universal nerfing of 2 kilometers an hour off its top speed. This hurts its acceleration slightly. It was nerfed earlier than that, long before, when it gave 50% bonus to power, all these things like that, but it's still a very solid cabin. All in all, it is a universal cabin by every right of the imagination. It's just great. It works with literally every single weapon and literally every single movement part, regardless of which movement part you choose, regardless of which weapons you choose. It will do something 100% of the time. It is pretty damn good. It's got decent power. It works on hovers because its movement speed is literally just on the cusp of that. You have to choose between the power or the reload speed / cooling, but ultimately the Omnibox is the first S tier cabin on this list because of the fact that it's just good. It's just good. Moving right along, is the Nova, next S tier cabin on this list. The Nova is an S tier cabin because it is the medium cabin with the most maximum mass in the game. But it is lower S tier than I used to rank it for reasons. And those reasons are they nerfed its speed. They cut 5 kph off of it, so now it's only moving 70. This is the same cabin top speed as what the Echo used to have. So they're moving it closer and closer to heavy cabin stats. And as anyone here knows, heavy cabins aren't good in general. In general, heavy cabins, they fall behind medium cabins and light cabins, and this is no different. As you move a medium cabin closer to heavy cabins, it starts gaining the properties of the heavy cabins, and it's going to start slowing down. With that, it changed its acceleration, which means it's worse on legs. With the 5 kph nerf, it doesn't do anything as... It basically does everything it used to, but just a little bit worse than it used to. And that's actually pretty brutal for the Nova. But the one thing that keeps it out of being dragged down into A tier like most heavy cabins will exist in is because of the fact that it's got 12 energy. So saving grace, 12 energy. From that, its previous competitor for best cabin in the game, the Beholder. It is no longer a competitor for best cabin in the game because Beholder is. Period. Beholder caught a nerf too, as did everything. It lost 5 kph, but at 80 kph, it is still exceptionally strong. The Beholder still does everything it used to. It is the best cabin in the game. I argue that now. I'm no longer arguing that the Nova is a competitor for that. The reason being that the Beholder has 2 perks. One, you don't have a cloak on your build. Now you do. 2, you do have a cloak. Now when you take damage, you don't decloak. This is huge. You combine this with the Rift, and all of a sudden you can double cloak for 16 seconds if you need to, or, you know, 2 get out of jail free cards. It's insane. Everything that the Beholder does, it just gets better if you keep pushing your skill ceiling. It's got pretty decent asymmetrical hitboxes. This actually is less weld points on the left side, which is the side that I'm mousing over here right towards the D. But other than that, yeah, no, Beholder, best cabin in the game now. Since that nerf. Before the nerf, it was arguable that they were comparable. Now, the Nova is still S tier. It still runs with every weapon in the game, but the Beholder does everything that it has done before, and it still does it admirably. Next up is the Hadron. I never really placed it, but I will place it now. Right here at S. Just kidding, it's A tier. So the reason why the Hadron is A tier is because it is the absolute best at what it does, and what it does is something quite niche, and that is shove bullets into your reloading gun faster. It's what the Hadron was designed to do. It gives you 15% reload base, then it averages the reload of all of the things on your build, and then brings them all down so they all fire at the exact same time, which can max out at a difference of 40%. What this means is... Everyone knows this already. You combine a weapon that you like, I don't know, Scorpions, and then a weapon that you don't, like, oh, I don't know, the King. And with that, you have a rapid-fire Scorpion, or a rapid-fire whatever. These kinds of builds are fun, but these builds are not necessarily meta. They are very, very, very good when brought into middling power scores, 10, 11k, things like that. But in reality, at end game, when there's no power score cap, everyone's going for the moon, shooting for the moon, 17 plus K power score. Hadron ain't exactly gonna take you there. Because the issue is, while you can get an insane reload speed, you can have it. The problem is that you don't have anything else on your build. It means that you're not gonna have a good engine. You're gonna be stuck with the hot red engine. You're not gonna have a cloak, which is huge. You're not going to have an interceptor. You're not going to have good radar. There's so many things that you're not going to have with a Hadron King build, because most weapons that it would be boosting take 6 energy each, and of course you're going to want to run 2 of them, either double Scorp or double, Tsunami, double Typhoon, and so on and so forth. Getting those guns out means that you're not going to have anything to back that up, which means that you're all pants and you're all talking no trousers, I guess, is a good way of putting it. But that said, it's still the best reloading cabin in the game. It is very niche. It does prevent people from just directly rushing you, because you will have a King Mine Layer, things like that. It creates some interesting builds, so it kind of changes how people play. It messes up their timings. So people who are good at Crossout will be like, okay, that guy just fired, I know when to move in. Not with the Hadron. The Hadron is like, no, I'm still firing. That kind of just boom, boom, boom. Brings in the reload meta, brings in the cannon meta, all that good stuff. But only A tier. Next up is the Cerberus. The Cerberus I originally gave a C tier to. And the reason why I gave it C tier is because of a lot of factors. It got nerfed, if I recall correctly, by 5 kph. So in reality, its speed is fine, but nothing really changed enough about the Cerberus to bring it out of C tier. It's very niche. It is meant to be the premier melee cabin in Crossout, but if you see my previous tier list, you know it's not. Unfortunately, it's got hitbox problems with its melee weapon, which is its perk. And that perk is supposed to be able to give you a grinder, which I think does 35 damage or something like that a tick. But the problem is that you can't connect with the melee weapon about a third of the time because you will hit someone's build and the top of your hood is going to get stuck on their build. And it's also the first cabin in Crossout ever to have a cabin that dips beneath the frame itself. So it actually is somewhat limiting in the way that you can build. Other than that, the Cerberus has decent stats. Cerberus isn't in general that bad, but what it does is niche, and you can make a melee build without the Cerberus. You can make better melee builds without Cerberus, and therein lies the problem. Next up into D tier is the Bat. It's straight a downgrade from the Growl, yet costs more power score. It gives you a teensy-weensy little bit more mass over the Growl, and nothing else. And it costs, oh yeah, by the way, one other note for the Growl, by the way, that puts in B tier. It is one of the only light cabins in the game, that and the Duster, that do not suffer from the power score inflation of light cabins. Light cabins across the board all have, they just cost more power score. Like 300 more power score for Epic tier and like 500 more power score for Legendary tier. Just straight up costs more power score for no reason. Cerberus suffers from inflated power score. That's unfortunate because you can make better melee builds, and you can make them with different cabins, and that hurts the Cerberus very badly. All right, next up is the Werewolf, and we're gonna move that to C tier. Just kidding. D tier, Werewolf tier. It was a D tier before. D tier again. What can I say? The Werewolf has a perk. Okay, so I will give a little bit of history about the Werewolf. Werewolf was one of the first 3 craftable epic cabins in Crossout. The Werewolf, the Humpback, and the Quantum were the first 3 craftable epic cabins in all of Crossout. The Werewolf was the light cabin, the Quantum the medium cabin, and the Humpback being the heavy cabin. The Werewolf has the worst perk in the game. Its stats are actually quite good. Like, going back through my notes, looking at the Werewolf actually has obscenely impressive stats. They're just quite impressive. It has a great top speed. It's got a decent power. It's just a good, in general, it would be a good cabin, except its perk is just abysmal. Its perk literally just generates a single fuse drone. The fuse drone was buffed recently in order to make it so that you had a chance of actually hitting someone with it. This wasn't recently. This was about a year and a half ago or so. But basically, originally, people would just keep shooting. After you exploded, the drone would appear, and they blow that up too. And so it had no perk. They gave the drone immunity to damage for 1 second after it spawns. This gives you the ability to move a little bit before they destroy it. But other than that, it's terrible. I've been playing this game, and I looked at my screenshots folder, found out since July of something in 2019. So I thought I started playing in 2020. No, I started in 2019. In the time I've been playing since July of 2019, in the time I've been in Crossout since July of 2019, I remember every single time the Werewolf cabin has mattered. 3 times. That's not an exaggeration. 3 times have I seen the Werewolf cabin's perk matter in 3 years. It's D tier. Next up is the Tusk. The Tusk I used to rate at A tier. And the reason why I rated it at A tier was because it's a cabin that is the best at what it does, and people do have to play around what you do. The Tusk is remarkably annoying because of the fact that you can run drones with it, you can run turrets with it, you can run straight boosters with it. It's a backup weapon of backup weapons. It's pretty dang good at what it does, though what it does is somewhat niche. In the modern day Crossout, does it still function? And the real question, the real answer that I have to say is yes. It still works. When Tusk comes in and removes a leg instantaneously, if you're on a walker, or Tusk comes in and removes a track, if you're unfortunate enough to be using tracks, or if a Tusk comes in and blasts into the side of you, it can be remarkably frustrating. There are people who are very, 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 very good with the Tusk. And they are very effective with it. Mind you, the skill ceiling on the Tusk is what is ridiculous. You need to get very good with this in order to make any actual use of it. For those of us who don't know, the perk of the Tusk says that as you move, it generates stacks. Each stack increases the damage that you deal with a collision from the Tusk itself, the cabin, anywhere on it, with your opponent by 100%, stacking up to like plus 300%. This gives you the ability to do phenomenal damage, especially considering the mass calculations in the game are very interesting. Or, sorry, collision damage calculations are very interesting because it's based on your cabin's weight, your cabin's movement, and things like that, divided by the speed of light, crazy stuff. But anyway, so even though Crossout has changed a little and the Tusk isn't necessarily in favor, I'm still going to give it an A tier. It's the best at what it does. What it does is niche, and people have to play around it. You obviously can make Tusk Lance builds. People hate those. I hate those, but that doesn't mean they're not effective. So there you go. Next up is the Harpy. The Harpy originally was given an S tier ranking because of how versatile it was, and I'm going to have to keep it there. The Harpy has 2 perks. It increases the amount of ammunition you get, and it increases the blast radius of everything that has blast on it. That in and of itself is somewhat niche. Actually, no. Holy crap. I didn't want to do this. Even though I originally gave it S tier, I'm going to have to drop it down to A tier. That's rough, because the idea is not every weapon has blast. It's not universal. You can't use it with everything. It is great at every power score you take it to, and it will work with just about every weapon with blast, but not every weapon has blast. You're not going to use this with whirls, right? So, yeah, it is probably the top of A tier, but it is an A tier cabin. It is a phenomenal cabin, though. I cannot stress enough how good the Harpy is. You want to fuse this thing for maximum mass. It buffs retchers. It buffs tsunamis, it buffs your cannons, all the cannons down the line. It will buff auto cannons, but I mean, auto cannons are pretty terrible. It buffs all rockets, things like that. Solid cabin, very solid, probably top of A tier cabin. If it could make it, if any cabin could make it to S tier from A tier, it would be the Harpy. It just doesn't make it, only because of the fact that with the definition of the tiers as they are, it's not universal. And so because it's not universal, it simply cannot make it. Next up is the Blight. The Blight is the quintessential niche cabin, A tier cabin, makes every flame weapon better. Name it, flame, Blight improves it. This includes things that you wouldn't expect, such as the Tempura or the Mandrake. Yeah, even though the Mandrake, by the way, this is just a side, it will not increase the blast damage of the Mandrake, it will increase the fire puddle damage of the Mandrake. Just a note. And the Harpy will increase the blast radius of the Mandrake, but it will not increase the puddle size of the Mandrake. So, Harpy, Blight, there you go. Yeah, you're going to find this cabin all up in Clan Wars, all up in your butt, because nothing but Blight dogs running around. So it's a dog-eat-dog world, and you're going to be eaten by a lot of dogs running around with fire. What can I say? Even though you're going to have to build mostly out of pass-through parts, doesn't matter. You're still going to have the durability necessary. Phenomenal cabin. You're definitely going to want to get a Blight for if you're ever running any form of fire dog. It's mandatory for remedies. Remedies do balls damage. Without something boosting their damage, remedies do not do enough damage. Blight definitely gives you that oomph that you need instantaneously. Next up is the Griffin. S tier cabin. Universal, works with every build, provides radar immunity. It will not break a missile lock that is currently on you, but it will prevent missile locks from happening. Makes you and your friends, everyone around you, disappear from radar on your approach. It can extend that air quotes invisibility bubble for a dog push in Clan Wars. It's just a phenomenal cabin. The things that it can do are phenomenal. It's got presently the highest stats of any light cabin. Solid cabin. Definitely S tier. Doesn't buff any weapon in particular, but it buffs your positioning to the nth degree. Use it on hovers, because it's got extraordinarily high power and great acceleration because of its high cabin top speed at night. I think it's 95. Pretty sure. Let me check real fast. Yeah, 95. So it's got a high power. It's got high power, high top speed. It's great on hovers. It's great on every movement part. Yeah, Griffin, S tier. Next up is the Cockpit. Originally, I gave the Cockpit S tier after a long and arduous argument against Quantum Canine and Rotfish. I've come to the conclusion that I am entirely correct and they don't know what the hell they're talking about. S tier, just kidding. So the Cockpit is unfortunately an A tier cabin. Why? This is really tough. This is tough because of the fact that it isn't universal enough. This is tough to explain. Cockpit is the first cabin with 3 pins height. The new cabin that might be coming out soon, maybe 3 pins height, we'll see. But right now it's the only cabin with 3 pins height. That's to the Cockpit's benefit. In addition to that, it gives the highest damage boost to literally every weapon type in the entire game, 40%. Used to be 50%, it got nerfed down. Though that is part of the reason why it is being dragged out of S tier. But it's not free. Ultimately, it isn't free. You don't get 40% bonus damage for nothing. You have to pay for it, and you pay 3 energy for it. And just like you pay 3 energy for that 40% damage, you pay 3 energy for that 40% reload. Hadron, Cockpit. You pay for that. It's not free. And so because you're not getting something for free, well, you are getting something for free. You're buffing the amount of boost by 50% that each booster provides with the Cockpit, but the mass on the Cockpit is the lowest in the game, so it's very difficult to actually drag the Cockpit into certain power scores. With its power score inflation and obscenely low maximum mass, it makes it so you can't bring the Cockpit into certain power score brackets down, which is interesting, and you also can't bring it up. So it actually has a very interesting power score band where it's hyper effective, but it falls out of efficacy the lower you take it or the higher you take it. And that's actually really interesting. So even though its damage bonus is amazing, it synergizes almost too well with the Yongwang, things like that. In reality, there's almost only one build with the Cockpit, which is the Yongwang build. Almost only one build. It can be used with other weapons, but such as the Hurricane, and it is good with that, but it is almost a one-trick pony. But it does one hell of a trick, as it can cut any build in half. So that is quintessential A tier, your one tricks that work very, very well at that trick, but it's not an S tier cabin any longer. Are you happy? You happy, Quantum? You happy, Rotfish? You sons of guns. All right, next up is the Dusk. Everyone loves the Dusk, and the reason why they love it is because everyone loves Pyres. Unfortunately, Pyres are not very good, and they struggle outside of a very specific power score band that everyone keeps dragging Pyres out of for some reason. The Dusk itself provides buffs that other cabins on this list provide, and they do it at all power score bands. Unfortunately, this is niche, which makes it C tier. It is a niche build that can be effective at certain power score brackets, but it struggles outside of those brackets, unfortunately. Next up is the Janabi, which is, I used to give it an A tier, but this time around, it's still going to be an A tier. So the reason why the Janabi is still an A tier is because it's still one of the best cabins in the game, because it's going to give you 20% damage, more or less, at the touch of a button. You know when you're activating it, all you got to do is turn your car a little bit. Thumbs up. So you just get 20% more damage when your car is effectively turning. Pretty good. Other than that, the only downside is you must be using wheels. So it cuts out leg builds, it cuts out hovers, which is the only one that really matters, and it cuts out tracks that no one cares about. It also cuts out Omni wheels, but whatever. So the Janabi, solid cabin, great light cabin. I believe it only lost 5 kph off of its top speed. Still great acceleration. It still has a little bit low mass, but you can completely work around that, etc. Pretty solid cabin. Next up is the Aggressor. The Aggressor is very similar to the Janabi. It is tied for the highest top speed in the game with the Cockpit, but it has the second lowest mass available on a vehicle, or from a cabin. Ultimately, though, the Aggressor's perk is comparable to the Howl. Interestingly enough, both the Howl and the Aggressor, you're going to get most of the time, depending on your build, you're going to get that perk when you're close to your opponent, but the Aggressor steps up faster. Once you've moved that distance, it jumps in 7% increments, 7, 14, 21. Mind you, it is almost impossible to get the third stack on an Aggressor, realistically, to get that 21% damage bonus, but unlike the Howl, the Aggressor can be used with turret builds, which allows you to drop turrets and just drive straight away. It can be used with missile builds like the Pyre, just driving straight away right before impact, or driving straight towards your opponent right before launch, things like that. And you can get a higher damage bonus than the Howl a lot faster. Also, in melee, if you manage to wedge your opponent, which is more and more difficult every day, but if you do manage to wedge your opponent and drive straight, the Aggressor's damage bonus is going to scale up faster than even the Howl's, which makes it slightly better than the Howl in many respects. Plus, unlike the Howl, who was nerfed down to 80 kph, this still sits at the game's highest top speed, presently at 100 kph, which gives this a solid B tier. It's a good cabin to have. If you have it, hold on to it. If you don't have any other cabins, go ahead and use it. It's pretty solid. It's like better than the Growl. If you have a Growl and you've been using like close-in builds with the Growl, the Aggressor is a decent cabin just to have. Pretty good. It's pretty good. Next up is the Dead Man. The Dead Man is, I used to give it a B. The Deadman is, or I think, nerfed down by 5 kph because it used to have 100 kph down to 95. With all of the other cabins moving down in speed, but the Deadman basically only moving down by 5 kph, that actually plays to its favor. It is just like the Hadron, except at lower power score. And theoretically, you don't necessarily have to pay for the Deadman's perk, but you also kind of do. So originally the Deadman was given a B tier. I'm going to give it a B tier again, and here's the reasoning. Here's my reasoning behind this. Both the Hadron and the Deadman both give 15% reload base. Why is the Deadman B, and why is the Hadron A? And the simple fact of the matter is the Deadman, you actually do pay for that reload speed. You're paying energy for it, even though you don't see yourself paying energy for it. So most of the time you're going to be using 2 weapons anyway. At 3 weapons, it's only going to give you 10% reload speed. But as you lose weapons, it's going to increase your reload speed from 10% to 15% to 25%. But the idea is that once you lose those weapons, that's energy that is no longer being used towards weapons. You're paying. You're paying that energy to get that reload. And in effect, it's very similar to the Hadron, but except with a much lower maximum mass. Though it is good. It's a solid cabin. And if you don't have a Hadron, Deadman is a solid backup for that. So we're going to stick with B tier on that. Next up is the Quantum. The Quantum, again, as I said earlier, was the original craftable medium cabin in the game, and back in the day, which is back when I made that tier list, the Quantum's perk basically didn't exist. Quantum perk says you do 20% more damage with energy weapons, provided you've taken no damage at all. If you take any damage, that got disabled forever. I know that it wasn't forever. Hilarious, it wasn't forever, but it was forever. It will never come back in combat, ever. That perk got buffed. The duration of damage, the time that you needed to not take damage was cut, and so now the Quantum actually has a perk. It has a perk and purpose. You can actually use this with energy weapons, etc. So with that, it goes straight to B tier. It didn't get out of B tier. Even though it got a perk buff, and its stats are phenomenal, and its geometry is perfect, effectively an upgraded Growl. The problem is it's still very, very ultra niche, only working with energy weapons, and also only working when those weapons are, when you've not taken any damage. So it's not any better than it used to be, but ultimately it's not any worse. It's a solid cabin. If you have it, hold on to it. I still have mine. I have one that's fused. It's decent. The Quantum is still a decent cabin, but it didn't make it into A tier after the changes. Next up is the Master Cabin, originally rated as S tier in the blind before it came out, and then after seeing it with my eyes, dropped it down to D tier because it was ass. Where does it land now? Well, this is a tough one because of the fact that it's about to be changed. They're changing the Master Cabin from a light cabin to a medium cabin. They're cutting its top speed from 95 kph down to 70 kph. They're changing the perk so that it automatically activates itself after you fully overheat, instead of making it so you either A, reactivate it yourself, or you wait an entire another 10 seconds for it to activate on its own. Crazy stuff, because those are some difficulties with Master. In a video that I made that I'll try to link here, where I go off on the Master and how shit it is, I mention that one of the #1 problems with the Master, even if the perk worked perfectly, was the fact that it's a light cabin. And as a light cabin, it cannot carry the weapons necessary to put on those nodes to get healed in the first place. They're fixing that. They're fixing it. Cool, right? All right. So by definition, this goes straight into the trash at D tier. Just kidding. If it were not changed, it is still a D tier cabin. Still D tier. Still useless. Nothing changed. It's ass. However, after the changes, I'm going to put it at C tier, even without playing it. Why am I going to drag it up to C tier? Because it falls into the definition, as I stated earlier, for this tier, which is your niche builds that change how you build, but not necessarily how your opponents are going to play against you. They're still going to clap you directly in the cheeks, but you're going to place weapons specifically on these nodes. You actually might be able to actually fit an actual weapon on it, like a cannon, something with actual hit points to be healed. So it's going to change how you play, but it's not necessarily going to change how people play against you. It probably won't have that big of an effect in combat, as evidenced by the video that I made, because they didn't change the healing mechanic or how much it gets healed. So there you have it, D tier to C tier, only after the changes. There's a big asterisk on this. It's still D tier right this minute. Don't go grabbing Master Cabins, chat. It's still D tier. And the market, by the way, currently on the Master Cabin is surging because people think there's going to be a resurgence for the want of the Master Cabin. No, it's not going to be much different from what it is right now. All right, next up is the Bastion. The Bastion is one of my favorite cabins in the entire video game. I love this cabin. I love it to death. I have a fused Bastion because of that. The Bastion is an interesting one. I originally rated the Bastion at B tier in its own hardware tier list because, again, you have to take everything with a grain of salt because this is my first tier list. Not saying I was wrong. I'm saying that my tier lists weren't defined like they are now. And second of all, the Bastion cabin I think it didn't get nerfed. Bastion did not get nerfed in the great nerfing of everything. It basically held. So there is that. But I did give it a B tier, and it was because it was the tankiest tank cabin, yada, yada, yada. It did all these things. None of that matters. What matters is it's in this current tier list. So presently, the Bastion comes in with a maximum mass of 15,500. Yeah, it says it has 20,000, but in reality, after you subtract its own weight, it's 15.5k. You can get a lot of durability on the Bastion, but in reality, it changes how you play, not necessarily how your opponents play against it. And the reason why is because you have to build specifically trying to make them hit your plate. You're trying to present the cabin forward. You're trying to make builds that make use of this massive plate to get that damage reduction. But players can just shoot you anywhere on your build, which is what most players do. They don't necessarily attack you from the front by design. Most of the time, they don't do that. So you are the one who is incumbent on you to turn your build to make sure that you're always facing them, to turn your build to try and intercept those shots, and do all that stuff just to make use of this perk in the first place. Is it tanky? Yes. When combined with an averter, does it work very well? Yes. But then again, so too do many other builds, etc. But, interesting story, the reason why the Bastion works a little bit better than other builds when combined with the Averter is only because of the fact that you're already presenting the Bastion as a target, whereas other builds, you're like, wait a minute, I should probably Averter this and then try and present this as a target. By the way, you can Averter the Tusk as well, as you should. But with that said, on a universal tier list, comparing this against light cabins and medium cabins of better quality, the Bastion, unfortunately, drops down from B tier to C tier. It's tanky, it's fun, but ultimately, according to this tier list's definitions, it would fall into C tier. You have to work very, very hard in order to make the Bastion's perk even relevant. And even then, it's not changing much. You're more tanky, but are you? Are you? It's tough. Again, love the Bastion. Unfortunately, can't do much with it beyond C tier. Next up is what I used to rank at C tier, the Cohort. I ate a lot of crap from this. In fact, believe it or not, in some of my tier lists right now, I'm still eating crap for this. Everyone says that the Cohort is a triple S plus, double plus plus tier. They're like, oh my god, Cohort is amazing. So let's go over this. The Cohort has 18,800 maximum mass, making it the highest maximum mass cabin presently in the game. Only 100 kilograms more than the Machinist, which has a 18,700 maximum mass. So it's got an eensy-weensy, teensy little bit of additional maximum mass over the next highest cabin, true. But here's where things are interesting. The #1 contender against the Cohort right now is the Irmak. Even though the Irmak has significantly less maximum mass, sitting in at 14,800, its durability is made up by the fact that it has a continuous damage resistance. The Cohort has damage resistance on call and buffs your friends. The Irmak is selfish, whereas the Cohort isn't. But the Cohort, unfortunately, also has an extremely large and geometrically interesting hitbox. So there are many builds you can do with the Cohort. There are fewer builds you can do with the Machinist. There's a reason why I'm bringing that up for future reference. So because of the reason why that there are many builds you can do with the Cohort, I will bring the Cohort up from my previous tier of C, replacing the Bastion as the tankiest cabin at B. And the reason why it's B and not A, nobody's going to change the way they play around the Cohort. The Cohort's ability is not niche, it's universal. But is it universal enough to make it S tier? No. It also lacks 1 energy. So remember, 11 energy heavy cabins, it's very difficult to consider one at S tier because 11 energy is insane. You're literally paying an energy for whatever perk it gives you. So whatever that perk is, it better be on all the time. Cohorts is not. It's on when you choose it, but after that it's off for a good long time. Cohort has a massive hitbox. And while you're generally going to be building a massive build in the first place, again, Mind Tugs, Masto Spiders, and things like that, in reality, there aren't that many builds that are going to use the Cohort, other than those. Like, what else are you going to build? You're not going to bring Scorpions. You're not going to build porcupines, and you're not going to build, like, what else are you going to bring? You're not going to bring incinerators. You're like, in reality, you're not going to bring 80 or 90% of the weapons on this cohort. So it's very difficult to get it above B tier. Originally ranked C tier because it was still niche, but no, I'll bring it up. I'll absolutely bring it up. Next up, one of the original S tier heavy cabins on my list, the Echo. Once again, that was only for the heavy cabins. If ranked against standard cabins, it would only have been an A tier. With the way things are, this received a major nerf. It lost 5 kph, which is a major nerf for a heavy cabin because it's a heavy cabin. It used to be 70 kph, and that was actually one of the deciding reasons to make it S tier. It was an S tier for heavy cabins, or an A tier. Now that it's down to a standard 65 kph, like almost every other heavy cabin, it's still difficult, though technically more easy to get in because everybody else moves slower. We're in a reload meta right now where being able to shove more bullets into your guns is a good thing. The Echo cabin is a great universal cabin. It's not universal, I'm sorry. It's not a great universal cabin. It's a great niche cabin. It's up there with all of the other reload boosters. Definitely at A tier. It's not on call like the Hadron, which is to say always on like the Hadron, or the Dead Man, but when it's on, it's on. 50% reload is the greatest in the game, and it gives it to you for a period of time, fast enough for you to machine gun people down. You've got low tier Hulk builds, you've got high tier everything else builds, you've got mine layer builds, you've got all these builds that can use the Echo. Echo's quite solid. The Echo comes in at 14,500 maximum mass, by the way. I'm only bringing up the mass for the heavy cabins because I did not bring this up during the heavy cabin tier list because that was before I was including those. The Echo is still A tier, but only just, unfortunately. Continuing on, the Humpback. The Humpback was originally ranked A tier on my heavy cabin tier list beneath the Echo and the Icebox. Interesting story, though. I have qualms with what I'm about to do. So, forgive me. Hanging in at S tier is the only heavy cabin that I will put at S tier. Only just, but it is S tier, the Humpback. Here are my justifications. Here we go. One, it's universal. Works with every single weapon in the entire game. I myself am actually having fun with the Humpback right now, making dog Humpbacks. It's insane. You can make tanky everything. It doesn't have the most mass in the entire game at 16,000, pre-fusion, of course, but it's solid. It's definitely solid. It's not in the bottom of the heavy cabins. Other than that, you can get that 30% stacked up very quickly. The damage stacks off of damage dealt anywhere to your build, not just your cabin. So unlike the Irmak, which the cabin must be exposed in some way to make the perk trigger, Humpback doesn't necessarily need to have that downside. Any damage anywhere will trigger the Humpback's damage bonus. So if you use things like tracks, things like legs, you could use hovers, but I've yet to do it, wheels, frame, anything like that, damage to pass through parts, bumpers, anything like that, damage dealt to you at all will increase or will stack your perk up to 30% bonus damage. Truth be told, you are most likely not going to reach that 30% bonus damage unless you are eating a lot of crow. Like a lot of people are trying to kill you now, at which point you won't be making use of that for very long. But with that said, it is universal, and with the ability with certain wheels that have just come out, you can actually get to 90 kilometers an hour on the Humpback. Yeah, 90 kph, even with all the speed nerfs and things like that, you can actually eke out a 90 kph Humpback rolling on people, getting that 30% damage bonus. You do pay 1 energy for this perk, because again, it's a heavy cabin, but you do get it at all times. Additionally, it changes how experienced players play against you. If they see that you have a Humpback, they will avoid you. They will actively not shoot you because they're like, well, if I can't finish you, I'm just stacking your perk. And that's only going to make you stronger and me weaker. So people will actually work around the Humpback, trying to not fire at it. Or they will try and power you down. Either way, it's changing the way that they move to engage you and not changing how you move to engage them. You're the one gaining the bonuses and so on and so forth. It is a reluctant S-tier heavy cab. I don't know how I feel about that. Suck it, Rotfish. Suck it, Quantum, if you see this. But it is what it is. All right. All right. Previously on S tier was the Icebox. The Icebox is a directional damage bonus of 15% all the time. Originally given S tier on the heavy cabin tier list, it's hard for me to rank this lower than A tier. I want to, but it's still good, unfortunately. It's still barely good enough to be A tier. It still gets the damage point thresholds where it will take a Typhoon through a Nova Shield. It still works with mines. It still works with nearly every weapon in the entire game, as nearly every weapon in the entire game has fixed weapon angles. It works with every rocket launcher except for the Waltz. It works with every flame weapon in the entire game except for, I think, the Mandrake. I'm sorry, and the Firebug. It works with so many things, and you don't have to do anything. You just need to play the video game, and you just get 15% damage. It means that you don't have to expose yourself to enemy fire like the Humpback. You can just stay back and get your 15% most of the time. Not most of the time, all of the time, as long as you have fixed weapons. It works with machine guns, so you can do front-facing machine gun builds like your Vindy Spiders, things like that. It's not the #1 choice, but it's good. It got nerfed down from 70 kph down to... No, it didn't get nerfed at all. It used to be 65 and it stayed 65. It didn't get nerfed. Only the Echo got nerfed. So yeah, no, it's still an A tier cabin. Slipping beneath, unfortunately, the Humpback, which somehow managed to come up fast. Funny how that works. The Jawbreaker. When it actually, believe it or not, the Jawbreaker comes in at 14,500 maximum mass. Do you have any idea how crazy that is? That's the same as the Echo. Can you believe that? Like, that's pretty insane. It's basically, the Jawbreaker has the same maximum mass as the Irmak and the Echo. The Irmak has a little bit more, like 300 more, but that's pretty good. With that said, though, you're paying energy for that, and you don't get anything out of it. Originally, a C tier on the heavy cabin tier list would be dropped down because of the fact that it's a heavy cabin, but it won't be because of the fact that it brings a lot of mass to the table. It's got awkward geometry. It's got pockets in its on its underside to allow you to hide fuel. It works well with tracks, though tracks are terrible. It can do the job, though. It's not bad. I mean, it is, but it's outperformed by a lot of other things. It is a C-tier cabin. Next up is the Machinist. There's so many bad things that I can say about this cabin. So many bad things I can say about the Machinist. And I will. First, let's go over its one saving grace. It is nearly tied with the Cohort with maximum mass. And that is all that I will say that's good about it. It suffers from its geometry. Its geometry used to be its selling point until you try to build with this thing. And then until you also try to utilize the perk that is associated with this thing. For those of us who do not know, the Machinist perk is hilarious. The Machinist perk says that it increases the hit points of any weapon on your build that is connected to the cabin. So please note, not any weapon on your build gets this, only weapons that are connected directly to the cabin. Okay, fair enough. What do the weld points look like? The weld points are abysmal. They are straight up the worst weld points that you can get on this thing. The front of the cabin is tapered. There are no weld points on the front of the cabin at all. So the front sides, which are tapered, no weld points. The tops of the sides, they're tapered, no weld points. There's no weld points on anything. This is the second cabin in the entire game to have the cabin dip beneath the frame. So it limits on how you can build at all. In addition to that, it's got a pocket in the back, which would be to your advantage, which is where you hide ammo crates. There's enough room for one large ammo crate and even an Apollo generator. And these are great things. But the problem is everyone knows this. And Scorpions, they just aim towards the back plate of the cabin, shoot right through, blow up whatever's there, kill you instantly. Crazy stuff like that. Also, in my previous tier list, it barely made it into D tier from I'm no longer doing this tier list tier. Only because I didn't know how the perk worked. Here's an interesting thing. I didn't know this at the time. They did update this. They did buff it, which keeps it in D tier. But here's how the perk originally worked. I gave it D tier, not knowing that this is how the perk worked. Originally, it gained, what is it? Your attached weapons gained 8% durability for every 1,000 hit points your build had currently. So as you took damage, your weapons all lost their durability, that bonus that they were gaining. So instead of getting up to 25% durability on your weapons, as your build lost hit points, you'd lose that 25% bonus. They changed it and said, whoops, hold on a second. It's now based on your build's maximum hit points. So that's how I assumed it was to begin with, which is what made it into D tier. And so now it stays in D tier. Making a build with the Machinist is a true chore, a true pain. There is one build in the entire game with the Machinists. I will bring this up because I'm certainly sure many people are about to type in the comment sections, "Wah, I've got the Kaiju." Yeah. There's the Kaiju build. Good job. One, there are 158, 59 weapons in Crossout right now. It works-ish with one of them and is outperformed by many of these other cabins on the list for that one build. So, there you go. You've got your Kaiju Machinists. Upcoming, though, there's going to be that new Legendary Legendary Weapon Cannon that's going to be huge blast radius. Is going to use 11, 12, 13 energy or something crazy like that. And maybe the Machinist it'll work with. But for right now, it is still D-tier cabin. It is abysmal. It is terrible. Its stats are fine because it's got a lot of mass, but the geometry is whack. The perk is useless. It's just bad. Trucker, also D-tier. The Trucker is a cube, comes with no perk, costs too much energy. It is like the Docker. It's a very bad heavy cabin. It does allow you to bully low power scores, but only just. And there are better choices for lower power scores out there. Not very good. The Pilgrim, which has no perk, I originally gave C tier. Believe it or not, after looking into it, I'm going to say the Pilgrim is the absolute bottom of B tier. Where it's placed here doesn't necessarily amount whether it's not the bottom or the top, but I'd say the Pilgrim actually makes it the B tier. And the reason why is because it's a solid cabin. The Pilgrim actually gives more energy than the Jawbreaker, but it gives a decent amount of mass. Like a solid amount of mass. Let me check my numbers just so I can give that to you. If I have that written down quickly. Pilgrim, yeah. At 10,300 maximum mass, this is actually one of the heaviest medium cabins. It's actually really good. In that if you're looking to get mass into lower power scores with 11 energy, Pilgrim's your man. It actually outperforms. It is everything that the Bat should have been from the Growl. The Growl basically upgrades into the Pilgrim. If you want 11 energy and you want lowish power score, but you actually want the mass to put stuff on it, Pilgrim is your dude. The problems with the Pilgrim, and this is something that hurts it, it is one of the tallest cabins in the game. Even though it looks like the Photon, and even though it looks like the Nova, the Pilgrim is larger than both. It's 1 pin taller. It's got more volume than either. Funny stuff right there. On to the Yokozuna. Yokozuna, originally I gave this thing a B tier, and that's against all of these things out here. I'm going to keep it right there. B tier. Yokozuna is the fastest heavy cabin, even though, if I recall correctly, it did... No, it didn't. It didn't get nerfed. The Yokozuna didn't get nerfed because it was only moving 65 kph, but it has an active perk that increases the power and top speed of the cabin itself. Funny story, Yokozuna perks do stack with other Yokozuna, so if you activate your Yokozuna perk and someone activates theirs and they send their drone over to you, you'll gain so much movement speed you can actually reach 120 kph in a heavy cabin. And with the Sabbath wheels, it only takes 2 Yokozuna active at the same time with the Sabbath wheels to reach 120 kph on a heavy cabin. This thing has extraordinary power. It has a maximum mass, or adjusted maximum mass, of 16,500, which should sound very familiar. It is actually more than the Bastion and more than the Humpback. So with that said, it makes an excellent Mind Tug, though it does not boost damage like the Humpback would or the Icebox would. With that additional power and speed, you can get in and get out. It isn't a bad cabin by any of those means, though it's not exceptionally meta. You're not going to be able to find it at lower power scores because you're not really getting much out of it at lower power scores. Its perk can be complex in that you don't always have an ally to target the drone with, and it can be a little rough and tumble to get that going, but other than that, it's a solid cabin. B tier. Worth holding on to, worth hanging on to, worth using. Next up, Step Spider, one of my favorite cabins in the entire game. Actually was my favorite cabin in the entire game until the release of the Hadron, simply because the Hadron is shaped like a Lamborghini Kunta. The Step Spider, I loved its lines, I loved the way it looked, though the cabin itself was horrible. Originally, the Step Spider cabin came in at C tier. However, since that tier list, what ended up happening was they buffed the Step Spider. They did. The Step Spider now has 5 kph higher top speed. That's pretty dang good. Unlike every other heavy cabin, because this is very similar to the Nova insofar as that is the second highest maximum mass for a medium cabin in the entire game, so it has many heavy cabin properties. They increased its speed, they did a whole bunch of other stuff where they did nothing else. But ultimately, that drags this all the way out of C tier into C tier. It is still C tier. It is still tied to one movement part in the entire game, which is the ML200 legs. ML200 legs are not good. They will never be good until they fix them, unless they improve the acceleration dramatically or something. It's not going to matter. The Step Spider's 5 kph top speed increase does improve the acceleration of the Step Spider when using any movement part, including legs, but it doesn't increase it noticeably. Step Spider's still in a bad spot because of that. And so for that reason, it is still C tier. It forces you to build in a certain way with legs, and even when you do build with them, it is not overly effective. Next up is the Jockey and the Hot Red. The Jockey is a D tier rare, and the reason why is because it's very large. It's got more maximum mass than the Bear, so it's your heavier truck cabin, but there's just better choices. You can choose the Bear, which is lighter, has better weld points, is smaller. You can choose the Fury, which is also smaller with the identical hitbox, but is even faster. The amount of mass that you have at low power score isn't necessarily going to matter. The Jockey does look cool, but unfortunately, the Jockey's stats and its awkward geometry, making it one of the largest, it's the largest rear cabin other than the Carapace. Second largest cabin other than the Carapace. Rear cabin other than the Carapace. Yeah, it's just not overly good. It stays, unfortunately, in D tier. The Hot Red, which is one of the fastest blue cabins, goes right back to C tier. Why? Well, because in reality, the Hot Red is it's a blue engine. It's a blue cabin that will carry you basically through the beginning of the game. Really good. It's almost comparable to the Wyvern, but the difference is how easily it would be to fuse. The cost of the Hot Red is higher because it's from a pack only, whereas you can actually create Wyverns. But other than that, no, it's a solid cabin. It is a fast cabin. If I recall correctly, it did get nerfed down to 80 kph because it used to have 85. But other than that, it's still a decent cabin. Next up is the Ghost, recently buffed. The Ghost's perk originally was completely and totally Bupkis. It was terrible. The perk is almost identical to what it was before, but what they did is they reduced the amount of the maximum damage, the high-end damage that you can get by 5%. Now, that sounds like a nerf. However, they changed the rate that the perk stacks while invisible from 1 tick every 45 years, so you'll never get any percent bonus, to 4% every second or so, which means that you only need to be invisible for a couple seconds to get to your 20% damage bonus. Pretty crazy. So this is a huge buff for the Ghost, allowing you to engage and re-engage faster. Other than that, they also fixed some of the crazy awkward geometry that was going on with the Ghost. So for those of us who don't know, the front of the Ghost cabin used to have an invisible pen that just ate up space. You couldn't build flush against the front of the Ghost because of its crazy awkward geometry. Beyond that, its weld points were all over the place. Even though the sides of the cabin are tapered and all this other stuff like that, they just straight up said, you can't build here because of this, you can't build here because of that. And basically it made it a mess. And so originally it was ranked into C tier. But with all these buffs to the Ghost, it's actually got uses. Like actual uses. It's not the best cabin, but also upcoming there is a change to co-drivers where you can basically get a double Ghost, where the Ghost's cabin, where, I'm sorry, if you're invisible while near someone, you can get an additional 20% if you're invisible for 1.5 seconds next to someone without taking any damage. So combine the fact that you can be invisible next to them and be invisible gaining Ghost powers, crazy stuff like that, that actually has some crazy potential. But rating things as they are absolutely right now, the Ghost has 10,950 maximum mass, making it a very, very, very chunky cabin. It's not bad. It's like 5th highest medium cabin in mass. It's got a perk that actually does work nowadays. It absolutely does work. Though its cloak is very, very, very iffy. So, unfortunately, I want to put this in higher than I used to, but in reality, the Ghost is still changing how you play the game, but not necessarily counterplay against you. And it does give a universal damage buff like those in A tier, like the Janabi, but getting that damage boost out is rough. I want to give it B tier because I think it's a pretty good cabin, but unfortunately it's C tier because it's too niche. It's very niche to pull off. It's very difficult to drive. It's got good stats, but it's also got super awkward geometry. It's like the Jockey. It's very tall, so people will see you coming. but it's better than it used to be. I will admit, straight up better than it used to be. And finally, one of my favorite cabins in the entire game, the Torero. The Torero, originally given S tier, very solid cabin at the time. 100 kph top speed back in the day. Unfortunately, that is not today. The Torero ate a 10 kph top speed nerf, and that brought it down to 90 kph. This makes it slower than every other light cabin, which makes engages and disengages a lot harder. It's got super excellent geometry. It's got super excellent weld points, and they did buff the perk. The perk used to be only a 20% accuracy buff with every single weapon in the entire game, which is great. But the downside is that the buff was increased from 20% to 30%, which is great, but it's not enough. In reality, the draw of the Torero was the fact that it was a medium cabin with light cabin speed. It no longer has light cabin speed, and already it was teetering at the very bottom of S tier. So that drags it all the way, unfortunately, down to A tier. I would have loved to have this tier list look nice and neat, where the Ghost was here and the Torero was here and everything looked all nice, but unfortunately, that is not the way the cookie crumbles. So, there you have it. There is the current, as I see it in Crossout, tier ranking of every single cabin in Crossout. You're welcome. I hope you guys enjoy this. If you guys like, please slap a like. If you have comments thinking that I don't know what I'm talking about, please shut the hell up. No, I'm kidding. Make your own damn tier list. No, I'm kidding. Feel free to leave those comments down below. Let me know how I've messed up, how you disagree with what it is that I've written here, and so on and so forth. Yeah, those changes to the cabins, I think, really shook things up, to be honest. Those patch changes where many of these cabins got chopped off at the knees, being brought down from what they were, and things like that really, really kind of hurts. But other than that, I don't think I have much more to say, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you guys for joining me. Feel free to watch me on Twitch. I stream there live all the time. Peace.